Welcome to the Green Justice Podcast. We are super excited and happy to have with us today Lee Beavington of Wild Spaces. And we also have Mark Harandi. We have our co-hosts
Greg Simmons, hi everyone.
And Paul Hirschman.
We are just going to jump straight into some of the questions. And I think over the course of this conversation, listeners will come to know you through the multiple roles that you have occupied and all the various positions that you've had at KPU that you bring into Wild Spaces. So let's just start there. If you can just tell us a little bit about what Wild Spaces is, what it includes, and what led you to it.
Sure. So I'm a learning strategist and interdisciplinary instructor at KPU, and Wild Spaces is a team of folks, student, staff, and faculty focused on ecological place-based education, or another way of putting that is intentional outdoor teaching and learning. And funnily enough, I think the pandemic is what inspired Wild Spaces, because just before, in March 2020, just before everything shut down, I met Amy Hustis in Fine Arts, and we wanted to do a fine arts and science collaboration. And then everything went suddenly online very fast, which meant it was very hard for educators to figure out what to do, especially me teaching an ecology course with field trips, how to put that online. And so Amy and I came up with this ecology and color in 1 meter squared. And the brief version is it had students go out to the campus grounds or a park or their backyard and return to the same space over and over again in a mindful way. Her students were focused on color theory, mine were on ecology, and then they did contemplative practice. They actually did watercolor. Doesn't happen often in second year science courses. And they did more research in depth on a particular plant and animal species that they were engaging with, and every few days when they went to this site. So I got inspired by that because it seemed to have a lot of traction. And then Amy implemented that into another course, and I did it with SFU in a couple of courses. And all right, this is really this intentional engagement with the outdoors seems to work really well. And so I put an application in for the Teaching and Learning Innovation Fund. I think I got a third email from someone saying, Lee, you should apply for this. I'm like, all right, I'll apply. And we got some funding for 3 student researchers. Since then, we've done like 22 or so events, including a community of practice. We have a expansive website now with resources and ideas around place and activities to do. But I think the biggest thing is the community building, and that when the pandemic was happening, people didn't want to meet in person in the classroom, but outside maybe. And there's something that happens when you go outdoors. People loosen up, they're more engaged. Studies show that teachers are more excited when they're teaching outdoors, and the students, the learners feel that as well. And so that really gets me juiced up to facilitate things where we go outdoors and everyone is sort of more engaged and happy to be there, but also increasing their their GPA or their creativity, as other studies have shown.
I've got a bunch of follow-up questions, but I do want to just kind of just double check with you to make sure that I'm understanding correctly. When you were talking about that initial project with Amy Hustis, you are going to the same square meter of outside area, like I'm imagining a variety of different kind of ecological or environmental compositions, but then you're looking at them through a biological, like scientific lens, but also through the arts and through so actually asking students to look at the same territory, the same area, but through different disciplinary approaches, as diverse as the fine arts and the sciences. Did I hear that right?
Yeah, so it's a real synergy between fine arts and ecology students. So the fine arts had a color theory focus because that was their class. And then the science students were an ecology focus. They were also knowing that other students were doing this. So there's sort of a community connection in that way, even though they weren't getting together. There was a sense that, other people are doing this as well. And then at the end of the semester, we got together online, and the fine arts student asked the science students some, more biology-based questions like, how does this work? And we had a sharing and a celebration of this process. So yeah, so it was, and then Amy and I also did cross guest lectures for either class as well, to really bring in the arts and sciences and the sciences into the arts. And the students had a really positive response to it. You know, it wasn't just sort of trying to put things online as they were before, but trying to actually transform how we were teaching things given the new paradigm of everything being online, and finding a way to do place-based learning through Zoom. It turns out there is a way to do it. It's got to be a bit creative in your thinking.
That's awesome. I mean, and I think one of the things I was picking up on that is because what I see in wild spaces is that intention to having different paradigms or trying to transform ways of seeing through bringing in everything from the fine arts to the sciences and social sciences and the humanities. Just such a spectrum of different approaches and different knowledge bases that are being brought into that.
Yeah, sounds cool. Interdisciplinary.
I can mention on that bit. Part of that is to slow people down and myself down, like bringing in poetry and contemplative practice and mindfulness to really slow, so we begin to notice and to sort of break down the educational silos that we have. That, you know, in science you do this, in art you do this, but actually all of it is relevant, especially when we're looking at holistic education. Studies have shown that, you know, being in nature, you get increased mental health and well-being, but it's not necessarily the time you spend in nature, it's what you're doing when you're there. If you have these ways of engaging in an intentional manner, like just listening to birdsong is one way, and you have a sense of being connected, when you do those things, that's when you see the benefit. But if you just sort of go in there and it's like a backdrop, then you don't actually have these effects on us. So part of me facilitating these wild spaces events when I'm the host or facilitator is to, you know, bring in sound walks and bring in a poem so that people get the sense of connection with the natural world.
Yeah, we were looking to maybe ask you a little bit more about this, connection with the environment and the more than human world, and how that gets built through things like walking through the environment and the other activities that you've done with students.
Yeah, so the more the human world, so coming from David Abram's work, right, where he coined that term, plants, animals, the rivers, the mountains, and connecting with them. When we go outdoors to teach, say, there can be a tendency to sort of do it the same way we did in the classroom. But of course, the environment is so drastically different, as are the learners and the educators, that we also need to transform our way of thinking and doing things when we switch that environment. And so anything I can do to open up that attunement to the natural world, to me, is really important. Because if we just go out there and you do a PowerPoint outside, then, you know, not a lot is changing other than it might rain and wreck your laptop. But if we're really attuned and attentive and allowed to be in a space where it could be a little bit of silence and a little more getting out of the human centric or anthropocentric ways of being in the world, then other voices start to be more noticed, right? The cedar and the robin, and the river. And then if that can happen, then those more than human beings have a sense of agency. I mean, they already do, but we start to recognize that, oh, wait a second, it's not just us humans here. We're surrounded by other beings, and they have ways of being in the world, and they have their own intelligences, and they have their offerings to us that they can give, and then what can we give back in turn? Yeah, and it's sort of one of the questions I ponder around reciprocity as well.
And that loss of egocentricity, right? And individuality as we conceive it, or we conceive it in certain contexts, right? Like the traditional institutional educational context with all its assumptions about hierarchy and how we learn as individuals. So it seems like you're saying you're moving away from that into a really more ecocentric kind of a approach. Sounds cool. Yes.
I really yeah, I like this word replica. I can mispronounce it. What do you mean by replica?
You keep setting yourself up. Now you're never
What
going
do you mean by reciprocity?
reciprocity. Yeah, thanks.
All right, reciprocity. So this comes from indigenous ways of thinking and being. If you look at the first people principles of learning, they're talking about experiential education, holistic learning, taking consequences for one's action. But a big piece of that also is reciprocity. So if we sort of take it to wild spaces and education, keep it in that framework, there can be a tendency to go outdoors and learn about, you know, the Douglas fir, or learn about this ecosystem. But then if we shift that, we might go a bit deeper then, okay, we can learn actually with and even from. So there's this, don't want to get too deep into it, but there's this human nature dichotomy, right? This dualism in Western thought. Humans are here and nature's sort of out there somewhere. But in reality, it's all interconnected and immersed. And in order to blur and break down some of those boundaries, we need to ponder on ideas around like nature as co-teacher. So if we're going out, there's something that the cedar could offer as well, something that I can't offer as a human, but the cedar could offer. And how do I figure that out? And how do I give space for them to be my co-teacher during this class or field trip, etc.? And if the cedar is offering something, then I really need to be offering something in return. And that's where the reciprocity piece comes. So, I taught biology for 20 years at KPU, and scientific methodology, you're the observer, and what you're studying is separate from you. And you don't receive from it, you're just sort of watching it. But if we want to really flip that on our head, to just wait and say, hey, wait a second, actually we're receiving both ways. It's a two-way communication, and we can learn something from each other. And if that's the case, then I need to offer something in return. And what does that look like? Well, it can be different things. It could be sharing a story about that place, trying to protect that place, watering that place, or offering some other gift.
Yeah, I think that really ties in nicely to that idea of the environment becoming a co-teacher, and then also kind of what that means for justice, right? In terms of what we're doing, how we're engaging, and that we're responsible over nature. So can you kind of speak to maybe what does the environment basically teach us about justice in this particular context?
Well, it's funny. One of the things when I hear the term green justice, the first thing that came to my mind actually was cheetahs. I'll come back to that tangent in a minute. I think when we are able to shift or try to shift from the anthropocentric to the ecocentric, and the anthropocentric meaning human-centered, ecocentric meaning considering all life having inherent value and therefore an agency and things that need to be heard. There's so many things we can learn from the natural world. Humans aren't doing a great job with, the climate and with species extinction, etc. But when you look at ecosystems, and I'm an ecologist, somehow they manage to keep going in the long term. When there's too many of this particular species, others start to eat them, right? And when this starts to go down, well, these ones fill in that niche, and they stay stable for long, long periods of time. So I think there's lessons to be learned there. Now back to the cheetahs. So I studied cheetahs and cheetah conservation in my undergrad a long time ago, and I'm sort of also thinking about intersectionality here a little bit as well, which is the idea about oppression being linked, that we need to consider race and gender and class, neurodiversity, etc. We need to consider many factors when we're talking about or trying to tackle like discrimination and oppression. So cheetahs. And I almost did this. I almost was the person going to go over to Namibia and save cheetahs. That was one of my young adult dreams. But if you go to Namibia, say, as a Western, and say, hey, we need to save the cheetahs and just them and nothing else, there's a problem with that. There's a number of deep problems there because you're not considering all the things connected to that area and to the cheetahs. So what they did is they brought in Anatolian shepherds, these dogs that would protect livestock from cheetahs bothering them, because farmers would just see it as a pest, right? They'll see a cheetah, they'll shoot it, because the farmers need that. They need their farms for their livelihood and to survive. So by bringing in these shepherds, it kept the cheetahs away. And so I meant considering, not just the cheetah, but also the farmers and the livestock. And so what ended up happening is sort of a mutual flourishing. And that's a big piece of, I suppose, of green justice as well, is the mutual flourishing of all beings, that not just humans or not just cheetah, but the more than human as well. And what does that look like? Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah.
Can I want to take listeners to a moment in a wild spaces walk that I went on with you, where at the beginning of the walk, and this was on Surrey campus, and we were gathering outside. There's, a group of probably, I'm going to guess maybe 20, 25, 30 people kind of gathered round. And I was really struck by the way that you did the territorial acknowledgement. I mean, we're so used now to having territorial acknowledgements at the beginnings of meetings or anytime people come together. And I really liked the way that you did the territorial acknowledgement through what you had learned about the relationship between place names like Indigenous First Nations names and the natural world. So I wanted to ask you about that because I'm just kind of curious, like what brought you to that, and what are some of the things you've learned through doing?
Sure. So for many years, I was observing other people doing territorial acknowledgements, and then at some point, I was like, "Wait a second, I should probably be doing these as well." Farhad Daster is one that he had these great intentional ways of doing territorial acknowledgements, and like, all right, I need to do this as well, even though it's going to might feel awkward and they're going to be uncertain. And I'm a very shy, introverted person, so to start something with something I'm uncertain about, like a presentation, that's a pretty big deterrent. But I knew I had to get over that. And so I started, and I'm sure the first few times it was a little bit awkward, and it was probably the rote thing for the website, right? Listing the First Nations and that were on their unceded territories. And then at some point I came across Len Pierre's Transformative Territorial Acknowledgement Guide, which is this wonderful guide, lays out really clearly in terms of, hey, here's how you can start, but here's other things you could do to dig a bit deeper, right? You can share a story, you can talk about your ancestors, and you can connect it to place. And so at some point, I started doing it unique, depending on where I was and also how I was doing at that time as well. I no longer had a script. I was like, all right, I still had brought a lot of intention to it and did my research for the history of that place and peoples and the more than human world, but let the place sort of invite me to speak in a certain way and be inspired in the moment. And so one of those times, I think the one you were referring to, Mark, is I researched the different names. I already knew some of the First Nation names in there, what they meant, because many First Nations names of places aren't named after people like colonial names are, but they're named after the lands or a particular part of the natural environment. So I did that at that particular time, and then other times I'll bring in my own personal stories or ancestry if it seems befitting, or I'll speak to the cedars that are surrounding us. Say if we happen to be in an area that have cedars, and so it's been a journey for me, and it's one I'm still very much doing and learning from, and trying to be comfortable with being uncomfortable at times. But it seems like a really important one to be on now. I think decolonization actually might be the most important work that educators can be doing right now. So I keep sort of determinedly stumbling forward in that work.
That's great. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, and thank you for sharing the how it can be an uncomfortable process, like this unsettling can be an uncomfortable thing to engage in. So yeah, thank you for that. And I didn't realize. I guess I just assumed that this was a way in which you would do territorial acknowledgements like almost habitually, but it's not. You're saying that it will actually change and that you don't stick to the same script each time, but that you will allow the circumstances and the place to inform how you do a territorial acknowledgement.
I think part of that is being neurodiverse. I like novelty, and so doing the same thing over and over again, my brain does not like that. But maybe more importantly is that it feels somehow more coming from the heart, and has more meaning when it's unique to each place and time.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, it seems so much more true to the actual spirit of a territorial acknowledgement, right? Within actual indigenous culture. So many seem and sometimes feel when you're doing them. I think that's maybe part of the awkwardness, that it's kind of, I don't know, for me anyway, kind of perfunctory, that I'm not really doing justice, that I'm not really in a position to be doing the acknowledgement because I'm not indigenous, right? Thinking about how originally it would be like a welcoming, or when you're visiting another indigenous territory as part of an indigenous people yourself. But anyway, yeah, that sounds very, very cool. Related to that, Could you tell us more about what you've learned about settlement in general and within the Lower Mainland through your exploration of KPU campuses? You know, patterns of settlement over time and its relation to indigeneity.
Well, I've certainly learned a lot from the different places we've gone, like KPU Farm and the Westerman property, say at the KPU Surrey campus. So I might speak to that first. I mean, you can, if you have specific questions, you can follow up with them. But because all places have, are layered with stories, and stories have these ways of getting their hooks in us. When I used to teach in biology, if I had a PowerPoint and was talking about prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, students weren't particularly engaged. But if I sort of started like it was midnight when I headed out on the kayak in search of bioluminescence, right? Well, and that's how I started my cell biology labs. The first thing I would say, all eyes are on me because suddenly it's like, oh, this happened to him, and there's this mystery, and I connected in to cell biology, right? Because it was talking about single cells organisms. So stories get these hooks in us, but they also have the power to potentially bring about care. If you know the stories of a people or place, then you have a relationship with them, and then you might be inclined to act to protect those places as well. So the Westerman property is I know some of the history of that particular place, and obviously the indigenous history goes back further than this. But the Westerman property is a unique spot. It's west of the Surrey Library on the KPU Surrey campus, and Margaret Westerman lived there with her husband Ernest. And when she passed away, she bequeathed the property to KPU Surrey. So the building's now gone, but they lived there for almost 100 years. And he was actually born there in this sod shack, I think she called it. And Margaret, in this interview with the KSA, she talks about how these trees were there when her husband was born, 1919. There were these apple trees producing apples. And it hit me when I was wandering through with the Westerman property a year or so ago that these trees still have apples, and those are the same trees she was referring to, and it's amazing. Apple trees don't usually produce that long, and so that's a green space at KPU Surrey, and you can imagine there's all sorts of ideas of developing that space. And if people don't know that history of who Margaret was, of the orchard trees that are there, and who they fed, then it might be inclined to just sort of put a building up. I had a arts practicum student with Wild Spaces last semester, Ahania Tansi, and she is from journalism and did some research, and she made 3 web pages, which we haven't made live yet, but we're going to soon, on the Westerman property, sharing some of these stories so that people can know about the history of that place. So that when it actually gets to, hey, this is what we're going to do there, maybe there'll be some acknowledgement or respect for what has happened there in the past, so it doesn't get sort of completely paved over.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was a really cool feature of the Wild Spaces walk that I think Paula, you were on that as well.
Right.
And yeah, and we went around and yeah, you see these apple trees. You think, wow, they're like over 100 years old. And we're on the farm that used to be where KPU Surrey now is. And not just apple trees, there's other fruit trees, I think, out there as well. And yeah, it is. It is a remarkable way of like feeling place, and it's just interesting hearing you talk about the difference that stories make, right? Like in the stories that tie us to place, and that how that can then feed into taking action, right? And acting in the present if we're connected with the history of the past. And I guess the other place that we both seen as well that you've taken tours to is the bog in Surrey. Richmond rather.
Delta?
The bog.
Brownsville?
No, it's
Oh.
on the edge of the KPU
Oh,
farm.
right.
So KPU has this 20-acre organic farm, and it backs onto this. I guess it's a bog or that used to be much more extensive,
Mm.
right? Because it would have formed a really wide part of the Fraser River Delta, which is being filled in through the process of settlement and built upon.
Mm.
Yeah,
I know that. There's a bug out there.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, like it's so interesting. Yeah, what you learn about this place.
Yeah.
Well, since KPU has so many green spaces, right? Just as instructors and even thinking of the benefit to students when we bring the students outside of the classroom, what are maybe some initial steps that instructors can take so it's not just a transfer of the inside classroom teaching to the outdoors, right? So maybe some initial strategies or steps to take. Obviously, maybe asking you some questions and coordinating with you. But any ideas just for instructors how we can kind of make that shift?
Yeah, Shauna Takacs and Accessibility and I are actually working on a guide on that sort of very topic right now. Sort of like a beginner's guide to taking learning outdoors and keeping in mind the universal design for learning. And I have a one-page handout somewhere hanging out on the website I could direct folks to as well. So the thing with taking learning outdoors, if you've never done it before, there are a number of things to consider and a number of potential barriers, like accessibility potentially, that can hinder you doing that. Also, there's the uncertainty of the weather, how the sense of, oh, we're gonna waste time by having to walk to a place. But each of these in turn can actually be sort of turned on their heads to become opportunities. So walking to a place actually is a great way to connect with each other and a place. Some of the best conversations I've had with my students is when we were walking on a field trip from one site to the next. So there's these conversations that come up that don't often come up in a classroom easily. And the Walking Curriculum by Jillian Judson is a great guide of, hey, here's like 100 things you can do with your learners while you're walking outdoors. The other thing is to be very clear on what your intentions are to going outside, right? Why are you going to this place? And what is the place you're going to, and what's the history and stories of that place? And then leave space for your learners to engage with that space. In academia, often it's very content focused and fast paced. Outdoor learning is the opposite. And so instead of focusing, okay, we got to get through these, 22 definitions or learning objectives, it's like let's actually have breathing space for conversations, for connection, and go deeper into some things, right? Sort of learning in depth rather than sort of surface skipping over a number of different things. So that's also a bit of a paradigm shift in terms of how you think, because you're going to do it slower. With the idea that less is more and more process than product based. So sometimes this can be a hard shift, but there are a number of very simple activities you can do. Just one is simply just be in a space and listen for a couple minutes in silence, or just be in a space and listen. And it can be pretty profound what folks will hear and experience and think just from the lack of talk and the lack of lecture. And then various mindful activities can also be engaged, also help with that connection with the place, but they can be tailored to specific disciplines as well. Outdoor learning is not just for biology and geography. I think it's applicable across the disciplines. Just have to be a bit creative in how you approach it.
I love that, bringing in the environment as co-teacher. That's fantastic.
I think, Paula, you jumped in and asked about how we conceptualize green justice. I think you were talking about that, Lee, when you talked about the tutors and that, but I don't know if you have more thoughts on what green justice means to you.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about that and breaking down the terms. So green, when we talk about green practices, often we're talking about like recycling or buying organic or taking transit. So there's these connotations sort of with sustainability. And then justice is more connected to things around peace or fairness or respect. So like, okay, can green justice be engaging in sustainable practices that bring about respect and peace for peoples and places? And I think that nature-based or ecological place-based education has a role here in that it can bring in that respect piece by actually experiencing a place and the more than human world, and then cultivating the ethic of care. And then therefore, there's lots of studies that show that when you do take learners outside, in addition to the many other benefits, there's also a sense of civic responsibility. We think it's heightened in those learners as well. So if they have that, they might be more inclined to engage in practices related to green justice.
Right, for sure. Okay.
Thank you, Lee. However, we go about popularizing this podcast, we will definitely include the link for the website for Wild Spaces, because there's so much going on, and there's lots of people involved, and there's just so many different pieces where students, faculty, and staff and the broader public, I think, can tap into it. So, but in wrapping up, is there anything that you want to bring to our attention or our listeners' attention that we haven't asked you about or haven't talked about so far?
I think I mentioned decolonization being one of the most important things educators can work on right now. So maybe just to speak a tiny bit more on that. I mean, part of the importance of that is when you look at First People's principles of learning, these are sound pedagogical practices. It's experiential, it's holistic, it's considering the consequences of one's actions, exploring your identity, engaging in reciprocity, etc. But the other piece is that if we're going to really transform society and educational systems, we need something that can really start to dismantle the dominant hierarchies. And decolonization is one path towards that. Indigenization is finding ways to be more holistic in our approach, both in education, but also more broadly speaking, to really consider the consequences of one's actions, right? When we see what's going on in the world, there's so much that needs to be addressed, and we need people to care and take action. And so I think that the action piece of reconciliation is an important one as well. Yeah, so it's one. I have a time release this semester for decolonization, so trying to dig into that deeper right now. And it was a journey it's been uncomfortable at times, as I mentioned earlier, but it's an important one, and it builds relationship and care for the world, and that's important right now.
For sure.
Yeah, it sure is.
Yeah.
All right.
Great.
Well, thanks
Yeah,
very much,
thank you
Lee.
so much.
This has been super awesome. Super awesome. Terrific.
Super awesome.
Thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us about Wild Spaces. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.